Stop whatever you are doing for the next 10 seconds and look down at your right hand. Lay it flat on the table, palm up, fingers pressed together, and compare two fingers only. The index finger, the one you point with, and the ring finger right next to it. For most people, this takes less than a second to notice, but almost nobody stops to ask what it means. If your ring finger reaches noticeably past your index finger, you're not looking at a random quirk of your body. You are looking at a measurement scientists have argued about for more than a century, quietly encoded into your bones months before you were born, and one that a wave of new DNA research has finally traced through tens of thousands of years of human migration to a place most people would never expect. For decades, this tiny detail sat in medical journals as a curiosity nobody could fully explain. Now it is being read as a kind of genetic fingerprint of deep ancestry. And once you understand what researchers found, you will never look at your own hand the same way again. This is not a new observation. People have noticed the difference between these two fingers for a very long time, long before anyone had a name for it. Anatomists during the Renaissance sketched hands in obsessive detail, and some surviving notebooks include remarks about hands looking balanced, index and ring fingers nearly level, while others show a clear step down from ring to index. Physicians in the 19th century, working before genetics existed as a formal science, noted the same pattern in passing, treating it as an oddity rather than anything meaningful. Even scattered references from classical antiquity mention hands where the fingers do not line up evenly, describe the way you might describe someone's height. Nobody in those centuries had any tool to explain why this happened. They simply recorded what they saw, and those observations sat unexamined for generations, waiting for a science that did not yet exist. That science finally arrived at the very end of the 20th century, largely through the work of a British biologist named John Manning, who began publishing systematic research on the subject in the late 1990s. Manning gave the trait a formal name, the digit ratio, sometimes written as 2D to 4D, referring to the second digit, which is the index finger, and the fourth digit, which is the ring finger. The formula is simple. You measure the length of the index finger from the crease at the base to the tip. You do the same for the ring finger, and then you divide the index length by the ring length. If the two fingers are exactly equal, the ratio comes out to 1. If the index finger is longer, the number rises above 1. If the ring finger is longer, which is the pattern this video is focused on, the number falls below 1. It sounds almost too simple to matter. Basic arithmetic performed on two fingers. But Manning and the researchers who followed him discovered that this single number correlates with an enormous amount of hidden biological information. And that discovery set off decades of research trying to figure out exactly what that information was. The first major finding was about timing. Manning's studies, and the many that followed, showed that the digit ratio is locked in extremely early, most likely somewhere between the 8th and 14th week of pregnancy, while the bones of the fingers are still forming inside the womb. Once that window closes, the ratio barely changes for the rest of a person's life. Researchers who measured the same individuals as children and then again decades later as adults found the ratio had stayed almost perfectly stable. That stability is what makes the trait so unusual compared to almost everything else researchers study about the human body. You cannot change your digit ratio through exercise, diet, aging, or any lifestyle choice. It was set once, before you had a memory, before you had a personality, before you had done a single thing in your life. And it has stayed fixed ever since, a permanent record etched into the skeleton of your hand. So what actually sets that record? The leading explanation, with the strongest experimental support, involves the hormone environment inside the womb during that critical early window of pregnancy. The bones of the ring finger appear to be unusually sensitive to testosterone exposure during fetal development, while the bones of the index finger appear to respond more strongly to estrogen. A developing fetus exposed to relatively higher testosterone tends to end up with a ring finger that grows a bit longer relative to the index finger, producing that lower ratio. A fetus exposed to relatively higher estrogen tends to end up with an index finger that catches up to or even surpasses the ring finger, producing a ratio closer to or above 1. This is part of why, across nearly every population studied, men on average show slightly lower digit ratios than women. It is not a hard rule for any individual. There's enormous overlap between the sexes, but as a population-level pattern it shows up again and again, and it lines up neatly with what we know about typical hormone exposure differences between male and female fetuses. For years, this hormone story was treated as the whole explanation, full stop. The ratio reflected your personal prenatal hormone exposure, and that was the end of the discussion. But as more research groups around the world began running their own digit ratio studies, a second pattern started to emerge, one that the simple hormone explanation could not fully account for on its own. Teams working in different countries kept finding that the average digit ratio was not the same everywhere. It shifted slightly from one population to another, and the differences were small, often only a few hundredths of a point. but they showed up consistently, study after study, decade after decade, across completely independent research teams who had no reason to coordinate their results. One of the clearest and most frequently repeated findings in this body of research involved East Asian populations. Study after study conducted in cities across China, Japan, and Korea, along with surveys in Taiwan and Hong Kong, kept landing on the same conclusion. On average, individuals of East Asian descent tend to show a lower digit ratio than the global average, meaning the ring finger tends to extend a bit farther past the index finger than it typically does in many other population groups. The gap was subtle, nothing you could reliably spot with a glance, but when researchers pooled large samples and ran the statistics, the pattern held firm. For a long stretch, nobody could say with confidence why this population difference existed. Was it truly written into the genes, or some environmental factor common across East Asia, something in diet, climate, or the way babies were measured by different research teams? The uncertainty lingered for roughly 2 decades, filed away as an interesting footnote nobody had the tools to fully resolve. That began to change only recently, as a new generation of large-scale genetic studies came online. And this is where the story shifts from simple anatomy into the realm of genomics. The turning point came from genome-wide association studies, often shortened to GWAS, a technique that scans the DNA of tens of thousands of people at once, searching for genetic variants that show up more often in people who share a particular trait. Several research groups built GWAS studies specifically targeting the digit ratio, measuring the hands of large cohorts and cross-referencing those measurements against each person's full genome. What emerged was that the digit ratio is polygenic, not controlled by any single gene acting like an on-off switch, but shaped by the combined small effects of many variants scattered across the genome. Within that broad polygenic signal, certain genes kept appearing near the top of the list, and the most consistently implicated were the HOX genes, particularly HOXA13 and HOXD13. These HOX genes are some of the oldest and most tightly conserved genes in the entire animal kingdom. Versions of them exist across an enormous range of vertebrate species, and they have been directing the layout of limbs and digits for hundreds of millions of years, long before anything resembling a human hand existed. In a developing embryo, CHOX genes act almost like an architectural blueprint, telling different regions of the growing limb how and when to build bone and in what proportions. Small variations in the regulatory regions that control when and how strongly these genes switch on can subtly shift the balance of growth between the ring finger and the index finger. A slightly stronger burst of activity in the region that becomes the ring finger, paired with a slightly weaker burst in the region that becomes the index finger, can be enough to tip someone toward a lower digit ratio. Multiply that effect across dozens of contributing variants, and you get the wide, continuous spread of ratios seen across any population sample. Here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because these HOX gene variants are not evenly distributed across the human species. They exist in every population on Earth. Nobody is missing them entirely, but the frequency at which specific variants appear differs meaningfully from one region to another. When researchers compared the population frequencies of the variants most strongly linked to a lower digit ratio, several turned out to be notably more common in East Asian populations than in European or African populations. A variant present in roughly 15% of one population sample could turn up in over 30% of another. These frequency differences, multiplied across the many small effect variants shaping the trait, add up to produce the population-level averages researchers had been documenting in hand measurements for decades. The hand, it turned out, had been accurately reporting an underlying genetic pattern the whole time. Scientists just did not have the tools to read it until genome sequencing caught up. The next question was the deeper one, and it is the question that pushes this story out of modern hospitals and university labs and into the realm of deep prehistory. Where did these variants actually come from? Did they arise recently within East Asian populations after those groups split off from other human lineages? Or were they inherited from a much older common ancestor and simply preserved at higher frequency in East Asia while becoming rarer elsewhere? To answer that, researchers turn to ancient DNA, a field that has exploded over roughly the last 15 years and completely rewritten large portions of human prehistory. By extracting and sequencing genetic material from skeletal remains, some of them tens of thousands of years old, scientists can now directly compare living populations to the actual ancient people who once inhabited a region, rather than relying purely on inference and guesswork. What the ancient DNA evidence suggests, when placed alongside modern population data, is that many of the key digit ratio variants are genuinely old, far older than any modern national or ethnic identity. They appear to have already been present in the populations that first moved out of Africa more than 50,000 years ago, carried along as those groups pushed across the vast interior of Asia and reached the eastern edge of the continent by roughly 40,000 years ago. Some of these variants have been identified in ancient genomes recovered from early East Asian remains, including individuals who lived tens of thousands of years ago in what is now northern China, among the earliest confirmed modern humans known from that part of the world. The variants were not invented after these populations settled there. They arrived with the very first wave of modern humans who reached the region and simply persisted, generation after generation, carried forward through tens of thousands of years of births, migrations, and expansions. The overall picture that emerges from combining ancient DNA with modern genetic surveys is one of extremely slow accumulation rather than any sudden event. As different groups of early modern humans spread out across the planet over tens of thousands of years, splitting off into separate populations that would eventually become the ancestors of everyone alive today, the frequency of these variants drifted differently in different places. In the lineages that became East Asian populations, certain variants linked to a lower digit ratio happened to rise to higher frequency over time. Exactly why this happened is still an open question. Some point to genetic drift, the purely random fluctuation of gene frequencies that happens naturally in any population, especially when it is small or expanding rapidly into new territory. Effects amplified during long-distance migrations, like the ones that carried early humans across Siberia into East Asia. Others suspect weak selective pressures were also at play, possibly connected to climate, diet, or some subtle aspect of fetal development, though this remains far less certain than the drift explanation. Most researchers currently favor a combination of the two, drift doing most of the early work and weak selection nudging frequencies further over an extremely long stretch of time. Whatever the precise mechanism, the outcome is what shows up in hand measurements today all around the world. If you personally carry a digit ratio well below 1, a ring finger that clearly outreaches your index finger, the genetics behind that trait, in a great many cases, trace back toward a lineage with deep roots in East Asia. That does not mean everyone with this trait has East Asian ancestry, and it is important to be precise about that point, because it is the part most likely to get exaggerated or misunderstood. The relevant variants exist in every population studied so far. Plenty of people with European ancestry, African ancestry, Indigenous American ancestry, and every other background on Earth show a low digit ratio. The trait itself is universal. What differs between populations is not whether the variants exist, but how frequently they show up. And that frequency difference is what produced the population averages researchers have been documenting since the late 1990s. East Asia stands out as one of the strongest reservoirs of these variants, but it is far from the only region where the pattern appears. Indigenous populations across the Pacific, including Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian groups, show digit ratio patterns broadly consistent with ancestral input from East and Southeast Asia, reflecting the enormous seafaring migrations that populated the Pacific Islands over the last several thousand years. Parts of South Asia, where ancient population movements brought shared genetic heritage from groups related to East Asian lineages, show elevated frequencies as well. The trait clusters geographically because the underlying variants cluster geographically, and the variants cluster the way they do because of the deep branching history of human movement across the globe over tens of thousands of years. For viewers with Southeast Asian heritage, whether Filipino, Vietnamese, Thai, Malay, or Indonesian, the story has an extra layer worth mentioning. Southeast Asia was a genuine crossroads for multiple ancient human populations. An earlier wave of modern humans, sometimes called early Southeast Asian foragers, reached the region tens of thousands of years before more recent arrivals. Later, a separate wave associated with the spread of rice farming and the Austronesian language family moved down through southern China and Taiwan and out across maritime Southeast Asia and eventually the Pacific. Both waves appear to have carried digit ratio variants, and both contributed genetic material to people living across the region today. Geneticists examining someone from the Philippines or Indonesia typically find contributions from multiple ancient source populations layered on top of one another, and the digit ratio variants ride along with that layered ancestry. Korean and Japanese populations carry their own version of this deep history. Genetic studies show modern Korean populations have strong continuity with ancient populations that lived on the peninsula for thousands of years, with additional contributions arriving from neighboring regions over time. Japan's history is more layered, involving the older Jomon population, hunter-gatherers who inhabited the archipelago for tens of thousands of years, and the later Yayoi migration, which arrived from the mainland a few thousand years ago and brought wet rice agriculture with it. Both lineages appear to have carried digit ratio variants, and the Ainu of northern Japan, who retain stronger continuity with the older Jomon population, have been studied separately in smaller surveys, with results that line up cleanly with the broader East Asian pattern. The modern Japanese genome is essentially a blend of these two ancestral streams, and the average digit ratio measured across the population reflects that combined ancestry. For those of Chinese descent, The picture reaches back even further and involves more internal diversity than most outside observers assume. Northern and southern Chinese populations carry genuinely distinct genetic signatures, shaped by different ancient migration routes over thousands of years, and researchers can often distinguish between them using genome-wide data alone. Despite these internal differences, both broad groups share many of the digit ratio variants under discussion, and both have contributed to the overall East Asian average that shows up consistently in the research literature. The Han Chinese population, by virtue of its enormous size and long history of geographic expansion, has been one of the most extensively studied groups in this field, and the repeated finding of a lower average digit ratio in Han Chinese cohorts has been one of the strongest, most consistently reproduced signals feeding into the broader East Asian pattern. For people of mixed ancestry, the digit ratio can sometimes act as a small, quiet clue among many. Someone with a single East Asian grandparent occasionally notices their hands lean toward this pattern, even when other visible traits do not obviously reflect that branch of the family tree. It is worth being extremely clear that the digit ratio is not, and should never be treated as, a genetic ancestry test in any formal sense. It is far too weak a signal to draw conclusions about any individual's background. But for someone who already knows their family history includes East Asian roots, their own hand can serve as a small, almost poetic reminder of that inheritance, written into the skeleton before they were even born. It is worth pausing here to address what this trait does not mean, because popular science, writing around digit ratios, has drifted into overreaching territory over the past 20 years. A lower digit ratio is not a measure of intelligence. Despite a wave of popular claims, it is not a reliable predictor of athletic ability either, and the studies that originally suggested such a link have largely failed to hold up under closer scrutiny and replication. It is not a measure of personality, sexual orientation, financial success, aggression, or romantic compatibility, regardless of how many magazine articles and viral posts have claimed otherwise over the years. The serious genetic and developmental literature is far more modest in its conclusions. The ratio is a developmental marker shaped primarily by prenatal hormone exposure and layered underneath that by a genuinely polygenic signal tied to ancient population history. It tells you something real about the hormonal environment you developed in before birth, and it tells you something real about a slice of the deep genetic inheritance passed down from your ancestors. It does not tell you anything reliable about who you are as a person, what you're capable of achieving, or what your future holds, and any content claiming otherwise is stretching far beyond what the actual research supports. What the careful research has actually established, stated plainly, is something more modest than the sensational headlines, but arguably far more interesting. One of the smallest, most overlooked details of the human hand turns out to function as a kind of biological record. It is a record of fetal hormone exposure during a narrow window of pregnancy, and layered beneath that, a record of inherited genetic variants that trace back through population history, in some cases stretching tens of thousands of years into the deep human past, long before any modern nation, language, or cultural identity existed. The trait does not announce itself. Most people go their entire lives without ever consciously comparing the lengths of these two fingers. But once you understand what those proportions are actually recording, your hand starts to look like a quiet little archive that you have been carrying around with you the whole time, visible every single day, waiting to be noticed. There is one more thread to this story worth mentioning, because it helps tie the whole picture together. As consumer DNA ancestry testing has become widely available over the past decade, researchers have started asking whether digit ratio correlates with the genetic ancestry percentages produced by those tests. The early results suggest a real but genuinely weak correlation. People who show higher percentages of East Asian ancestry in their DNA test results do tend, on average, to show slightly lower digit ratios. This correlation is far too weak to function as any kind of individual ancestry indicator, and nobody should attempt to use it that way. But if viewed across large populations rather than individuals, the pattern holds up, and it represents the hand and the DNA telling essentially the same underlying story from two completely different angles, one visible on the surface of the body and one buried in the molecular code inside every cell. This same line of research keeps expanding in directions that anatomists from earlier centuries could never have imagined. Researchers are now examining how digit ratio variants interact with other genes involved in embryonic development, how the relevant variants are distributed across smaller regional subpopulations within East and Southeast Asia, and whether ancient populations that left few or no direct descendants carried the same variants seen in living groups today, or different ones entirely specific to lineages that have since disappeared. The overall picture keeps filling in a little more each year as additional ancient genomes get sequenced and additional living populations get sampled around the world. The human hand will likely remain relevant to this research for a long time to come, simply because it is one of the only externally visible markers of a developmental process that otherwise unfolds entirely hidden inside the body, invisible until the moment someone is born. For anyone who happens to carry this trait, there is something genuinely worth sitting with here. You did not choose your own digit ratio. You did not choose the genetic variants you inherited, and you certainly did not choose the ancestors who carried those variants across mountain ranges, river valleys, and open coastlines tens of thousands of years before any modern country, border, or national identity existed anywhere on Earth. And yet, that inheritance is real, sitting quietly on your hand right now, present since before you were born, and it will remain there for the rest of your life. A small, silent record of where the long chain of people behind you happened to travel across the deep span of human history. There is also something worth appreciating about how universal this trait is, even with its regional differences in frequency. The relevant genetic variants exist in every human population, without exception. Every population shows the full range of digit ratios, from clearly lower than 1 to clearly higher than 1. The differences researchers have documented are differences of frequency and average, not differences of presence or absence. When scientists map digit ratio data across the world, they do not find sharp boundaries separating one group from another. What they find instead is a gradient, a slow, continuous shift in population averages from one region to the next, with enormous overlap at every point along that gradient. Two people chosen entirely at random from any two different populations on Earth are, on average, far more similar to each other in digit ratio than they are different. The pattern that researchers have spent decades documenting is a population-level pattern, a story told through statistical averages across thousands of measured hands. It was never meant to function as a label that could be applied confidently to any single individual hand in isolation. Every human hand, regardless of where its owner's ancestors happened to come from, is carrying the exact same kind of record, shaped by the same ancient developmental machinery, connected through an unbroken chain of inheritance stretching back to the very first modern humans who ever walked out of Africa. The next time you glance down at your own hand, you are looking at something considerably older and stranger than it first appears, a quiet fragment of deep time resting in plain sight at the end of your own arm.